All of us must be familiar with the saying, prevention is better than cure. And many times we see from our own experiences that it is always better to be prepared to take precautions rather than repenting later on. And this requires a sense of alertness, a sense of awareness, and also a sense of foresight, thinking in advance and taking the precautionary measures for anything that may not go according to plan. We see that in today's world there is a lot of uncertainty. The pandemic has taught us how to live in the midst of uncertainties. And we see that at every step we need to take certain precautions, certain preventions. We need to think ahead in order to be better prepared. Today's gospel will tell us the same message, being prepared for anything that may be thrown to us. Similarly, today's first reading will talk to us about how the values that the gospel asks us to follow are in opposition or completely different to the values of the world. And in this way, we sometimes may be carried away by what the world thinks. But as we read today's gospel passage, as we hear about the parable of the 10 virgins, why do you think that the 5 wise virgins were not willing to share the oil with the 5 foolish ones? And was it selfishness on part of the 5 wise ones? And why do you think that the 5 foolish ones did not adequately prepare for the wedding? Well, let's find that out during today's episode of Tea Time with the Word. But before we can begin our reflection, let us take a look at the readings for Friday in the 21st week of Ordinary Time. Today's first reading is from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 17 to 25. And the Gospel is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 1 to 13. Today's first reading will speak about the wisdom of God, and the Gospel will speak on the message of preparedness and being ever ready to face any challenge that the world may throw at us. And in a way, we are all called to be ready, to be prepared to face anything that life may challenge us with. And if one is prepared, one can adequately face the challenge without having any much trouble. Turning our attention to today's first reading, we see that St. Paul tells the people of Corinth that what they think, what others may think about you, may not be true. In a way, the gospel values we see are opposed to the values of the world. And therefore, when you practice virtues such as humility, simplicity, detachment, he says that the world may laugh at you, the world may ridicule you, the world may consider it to be foolish. But he says it is not foolishness, it is the wisdom of God. And similarly, when we follow the gospel values, it does not mean that we are weak. It means that we are strong enough in order to face the persecution and in spite of the difficulties, still to persevere in it. In a way, in today's world, following the gospel values is a challenge. And we all know the circumstances in which we live in. And in spite of all this, we see that there are many people who follow the gospel values and who live a model and exemplary life. And this indeed shows that they are wise and they are strong. Because what is wise in the eyes of the Lord may look foolish to the world, but it is not so. because ultimately we see that everything comes from God and goes to God. Turning our attention to today's gospel passage, we have yet another parable, and this time it is the parable of the 10 virgins. And what does this parable tell us? First and foremost, it tells us to always be prepared, because we do not know what situations we may face or what problems may arise. Therefore, if one has foresight, if one is able to think ahead and prepare oneself, then one is already ready to encounter any challenges that they may face. And therefore, we see that one's preparedness and readiness would enable them in order to encounter Jesus even in unforeseen moments. In a way, all of us, through today's parable, are called to act like the 5 wise virgins who prepared themselves for the coming of the groom. Now, in those days, it was a custom for the bridesmaids to carry light with them, and this also added some kind of joy and festivity to the whole wedding procession. Now, we see that in this parable, there were 10 virgins who were all ready to perform this duty. But we see that some of them had prepared in advance, whereas some of them had not prepared. Some of them had taken with them oil in reserve, but there were the others who had not. They had just taken the lamps and gone with them. And therefore, like the 5 wise virgins, we are called to be clear about the purpose for which we are sent. And therefore, it means that we should foresee certain difficulties and we must be ready to counter them. We must always have a kind of a backup plan. If plan A doesn't work, we should always have something in reserve so that we can then perform the mission which we are sent to accomplish. And each one of us are called to strive to be faithful and dedicated with each and every passing opportunity. And we are called to do our best to become worthy servants and disciples of the Lord. In this way, we see that in everything we do and say, we need to glorify the Lord and we need to radiate His joy, love, and goodness to the world around us. In today's parable, we see that Jesus makes it very clear that there is a real possibility that some people may not be saved. And why is this so? This is because of their own personal choices. We see that Jesus never forces anything upon us. He gives us the free choice. Everything is left up to us. We can either accept it or reject it. And hence we see that there are many people who reject the grace and the blessings of the Lord. And that is why Jesus says that there is a possibility that these who reject the opportunities presented to them may not make it to the kingdom of heaven. And therefore, one should be always ready and prepared. Because if one is not prepared, one may not be able to see God present in those opportunities. And therefore, he says that the most terrible thing that could happen for any person is to hear the words, "I do not know you." And therefore, when we analyze the gospel passage and the parable once again, we are all told that we need to be like the 5 wise virgins. But what about their attitude towards the 5 foolish virgins? Now, we see that when at midnight the bridegroom came, all of them were asleep. When they heard that the bridegroom was coming, and there was one person who was there in order to announce to them. And with that, they all got up and began preparing their lamps. It is at this time that the 5 unwise virgins realized that their oil lamps were running out of oil. And in this way, it was a bit late for them to do anything. Now, when they asked the 5 wise virgins for oil, we see that the 5 wise virgins refused to give oil. Now, do we call this selfishness? Or is it the priority that the 5 wise virgins had? Well, we can say that it was their priority because for them the most important thing was to be ready when the bridegroom came. And in a way, the 5 unwise virgins followed the advice of the 5 wise virgins and went to get oil. And when they came, the bridegroom had come and the doors were closed. And therefore, this also calls us to give priorities to things in life. And as we reflect on today's gospel passage, let us ask the Lord for the grace that we may be attentive to what is happening and that we may be ever ready and prepared to encounter any challenges that the world throws at us. Amen.